Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jay Bellis, and today I will be beginning the total narration of my debut novel, A Fatal Time to a Final End. Before I begin, I apologize for the graininess of the video, but I am using merely a webcam until I can upgrade to a more fancy technology. To my family, and to the fiends I once foolishly called friends. Chapter I. Cromwell's Excursion. Ellison Primsler hurriedly made his way through the dark, windy fall evening, peering ceaselessly into the shops, eating establishments, and bars lining the sidewalk to his left. He was looking for someone. Up ahead was a bar, which he dreaded approaching, for he had the portentous feeling in his stomach that tonight would end up like many others that had plagued him as of late. As he got closer, he heard the telltale noise of a fight, and let out a discouraged sigh, quickening his pace and tucking his tie back into his jacket. Right as he reached the bar, he gazed in through the large plate-glass window that bore the name of the place, only able to make out two silhouettes, one large and towering, the other thin and swaying on his heels, most likely from inebriation. Suddenly, the big silhouette lurched forward, a dull thud of a punch sounded off, and the others of the silhouettes went stumbling backward toward the large window. Out of instinct, Ellison stepped back from the window as the character's back careened into it, the force shattering the window into thousands of shards. The fellow came falling out through, arcing through the air before slamming down onto the unforgiving pavement. Ellison and the bar-goers stood in awe for a few tense moments, staring down at the crumpled man who lied unmoving amidst the glass. Slowly the fellow propped himself up with his elbows, wavered for a moment, and then hazarded back to his feet. When he was upright, he slapped the shards of glass off of his black overcoat and looked in through the window at the man who'd punched him through it. "You may contact my publisher about reparations, sir." His voice was cool and deep, without any hint of emotion in it. "My hat, please," he shouted in. A black flat cap was carelessly tossed out at him, and he caught it, placing it on his head and turning to face a flabbergasted Ellison. Without addressing him, he walked past, slowly down the sidewalk. Ellison snapped out of his awe and tagged along behind the man. "Stanley, are you all right?" Stanley turned his head with a whimsical expression on his face. "Of course, Primsler. Now take me home, will you?" Ellison replied with a long, exasperated sigh. "You can't keep doing this. You're going to get yourself killed," he scolded, walking past Stanley and starting on his way toward the alley where the car was parked. Stanley laughed and propped up his coat collar, casting a few small pieces of glass to the ground. "Impossible! It would seem that I'm invincible, but maybe that's the saws talking," he shouted toward Ellison. He followed with, "I'll be waiting here." As Ellison disappeared into the evening's somewhat ubiquitous fog, Stanley took a cigar out of his breast pocket, struck a match off of the lamp-post he was standing under, and lit it. Within moments he was puffing large clouds of smoke out into the evening air, thinking of nothing in particular. There was a dull ache in his back, and a drop of blood dripped into his left eye, causing him to recognize that he had quite a gash above his eyebrow. As he felt it, he also realized the area around his eye was swelling into an unsightly bruise. That angry fellow at the bar must have really whacked him good, and he was so drunk he barely felt the pain. Swaying there, smoking his cigar, his mind took him swimming back into the dark as it usually did on evenings like these. A haunting shiver overtook him. The memories of sorrow that lurked behind his emerald green eyes were starting to peel away the contentedness that his excessive drinking was able to bestow. "Gwendolen," he muttered, exhaling 2 thick lines of smoke from his nostrils. "Why?" he asked the night sky. Before his gloom could fully overtake him, Ellison pulled the car up, a black Jaguar XK150 with white wall tires. Stanley got into the passenger seat and slumped back, the half-smoked cigar protruding limply from his drooping mouth. "Stanley, I really wish that you'd stop that revolting habit of yours." Stanley rolled his head across the headrest to face Ellison. He looked past the glare of Ellison's round spectacles and into his eyes. "Primsler, I've told you 1,000 times. It helps me think." "Jesus, like you really need help doing that," he snorted with skepticism. Stanley made no response, but smiled, chortling a bit, before peering out the window. He rolled it down and blew a smoke ring out of it as Ellison put the car into gear and headed toward their home on the shoreline. After a bit of silent driving, Ellison looked back over at Stanley, who was furtively taking a swig from a flask. He swallowed quickly and met Ellison's glance. Another look of disapproval crossed Ellison's face, but he did not address it. "Earlier, your agent called." "Oh?" Stanley said, partially interested. "He wants us to go to Massachusetts for an interview and book signing," Ellison said in a low tone, figuring there to be an impasse over the subject. Stanley shook his head and turned back toward the window. "Not a chance in hell that I'm going down there to deal with a bunch of mud-slinging charlatans." "All those people are your fans, you stubborn bastard," Ellison grumbled. "Most of them merely want to separate the man from the fiction," Stanley exclaimed, pointing a wavering finger over at his friend. "What does that even mean?" "They want to tear me from my veil of mystery and intrigue, to pull me from my reclusiveness. Isn't that a good thing? The general fan base and media would no longer be able to make up wild stories about you. You could show them who you really are." Ellison paused, pondering whether his next statement was worth mentioning or not, considering it would be at the interpretation of Stanley's raw emotions. He decided to go with it. "In addition, you could finally attend to the libelous remarks made by Miss Lovelace." "She has nothing on me. The good people of the literary world would never take what she said into accord. Besides, it's pretty common knowledge that she's not of all that sound of a mind." "You'd be surprised what people are willing to believe about someone, especially if there's only one source of information." Ellison paused again, looking at Stanley to try and gauge if anything he was saying was actually getting through to him. Nothing seemed to be. He was shutting himself off and retreating into his vagaries. "In one of the feature articles I read about you, they described you as a master of writing at the sacrifice of a moral compass, and that you were an alcoholic, suicidal basket case with one hell of a temper." Stanley laughed and took a deep breath, nodding. "Sounds about right, except for the suicide part. I'm just waiting for fate to make its move. Hopefully soon." He took another swill from his flask and another puff from his nearly finished cigar, to convey the point. "Also, I find myself to be pretty even-tempered for the most part." "Oh yeah? Then what the hell did someone punch you through a window for?" Stan laughed again and shook his head with fondness. "Well, you see, this girl approached me and asked if I was the great S. Kane Cromwell. Her vivacious attitude brought me out of my despondency for a short time, and we began chatting about nothing in particular. Actually, she just kept telling me how much of a genius I was and that all my poems were beautiful. There were intermittent questions about my muses and all that, but that's inconsequential to the story. So, a ways into our colloquy, she asked me to recite one of my eloquent poems. In the rather drunken state I was in, and currently am in, the only poem that came to my mind was To My Lovely. I recited it with vigor, and admittedly was a little blushed, for this young woman was quite pretty and seemingly coquettish. Subsequently, as I finished the last verse, staring into her eyes, a hulking man with much less than half a brain traipsed over to the table. From his somewhat limited point of view, he figured that I was putting the moves on this girl, who turned out, unfortunately enough, to be his girlfriend. His confrontational and overly offensive demeanor, not to mention his lack of intelligence, irritated me to the highest degree. Of course, at that point, I made several comments that exacerbated the situation, and the rising action thus led to the climax of my extrication. Ellison was quiet for a while, never ceasing to be amazed at the clarity Stanley portrayed under the heavy influence of alcohol. Stanley, back to the interview. Damn it, Primsler, I told you I'm not going. He flicked the butt of the spent cigar out the window. Yes, we are. You haven't written anything in over a year, and Pierce informed me that he's going to drop your contract unless you do something. This is the perfect occasion to rekindle your popularity and get your career moving again. It is an opportunity that you cannot refuse. Stanley responded with a thick silence. The only sound within the car was the whirring of the cruel wind, cutting in through the open window on Stanley's side of the car. He was quiet for so long that Ellison glanced over at him several times to make sure he hadn't passed out. Every time he looked, his eyes beheld the same thing, the perturbed writer just staring out the window with a grim expression adorning his face, and his black, tendril-like hair dancing across his forehead to the command of the wind. Ellison turned off the main road and pulled up their private drive. When he parked the car, Stanley hastily got out, striding up the stone stairway to the towering double front doors of their house. He took a set of jingling keys from his pants pocket, unlocked the door, and pushed it open, disappearing into the darkness behind it. Ellison watched the sulky display and cast his eyes upward to the myriad stars and the bright moon that was bathing the estate in a bluish-gray light. His eyes traced across the sky and fell upon the fresh yellow glow of a light coming from one of the windows of the house. Behind the window was Stanley's study. At least he's situated, Ellison thought to himself. Spending a few more moments enjoying the darkness, he took out his phone and called Pierce. Hello. Yes, I know what time it is. My apologies. Could we discuss some things over coffee tomorrow morning? Okay. See you at 9. Ellison ended the call and put the phone in his pocket, pondering on whether what he was doing was right or not. However, he decided that his energies were best placed on other matters when he heard the smashing of glass from inside the house. Without hesitation, he ran inside to see what new turmoil awaited him. Ascending the spiral staircase, nearly sprinting down the dim hallway and throwing the heavy oak door to Stanley's study open, he saw his friend standing beside the long mirror at the corner of the room, between two of his bookcases. His palm was open and there was blood covering it and dripping down onto the floor. The mirror had a web of cracks, about the size of a fist in the middle, with smaller splits branching off to all ends of the frame. Ellison also noticed how ghastly Stanley's face looked from the scuffle earlier in the evening. There was a long gash above his eyebrows caked with drying blood, and his cheekbone was swelling and turning a brownish-purple hue beneath the skin. His eye was not unscathed either, for several blood vessels had burst, causing there to be a small cloud of blood hovering in the whites of it. Ellison tilted his head with emphatic pity for his friend. My God, are you all right? He said in a low, almost pained tone. Stanley turned his attention from his bloody hand to Primsler. Fine. If you're implying my eye and the cut above, well, that just needs a butterfly band-aid or whatever those things are called. He paused to feel his swelled cheekbone and grimaced to the touch. Perchance it's an orbital fracture there, but it will get better with time, I suppose. What happened to the mirror? The drunken writer craned his head back and glanced at it, then down at his hand. I cannot stand the reflection it produces any more. The sunken eyes, the dark bags residing underneath, the unkempt hair, the gloominess, the stooping stature, the memories of who I once was. There was wavering frustration in his voice. Ellison stood in the doorway insipidly, with a lack of something good to say. There before him was a fellow who had been his best friend since they were children, who had been there whenever he needed him, who had grown up with him. He knew that this man was in fact not who he once was. The innocence and joy in his life had completely eluded him. All that was left was a husk. And the most troubling thing was that Ellison knew in his heart that Stanley could go back to being who he was before. The happiness that had evaded him for so long could be ascertained again if he would just let go of the past. The incident more specifically, was the greatest barrier in his mind and soul, and it was one that he refused to tear down. I do not wish to usurp any more of your time, my friend, especially at such an ungodly hour. Leave me to my manacles. Having said this, Stanley turned away from Primsler and collapsed into the red leather armchair by the fireplace, covering his face with his bloody hands. Unsurely, Ellison hovered there, still looking upon Stanley with sympathy. "At least allow me to bring you a towel for your wounds," he said, leaving and getting a white one from the bathroom down the hall. By the time he got back to give it to him, he found that Stanley was passed out, cold, and slumped over in the chair. Ellison shook his head and began patting the blood off from the cut on his head. After it was mostly cleared off of the congealing liquid, he moved on to Stanley's hands, wiping off the filmy blood from his knuckles and palms. When he finished, he set the towel in the marble tub and retired to his own bedroom. Once he took his clothes off, he fell into the cashmere sheets and stared at the ceiling for a while, thoughts about Stanley preventing him from drifting off into a peaceful sleep. 4 times, it had been, in the last 2 months that Stanley had been in bar fights or other infractions. He was getting worse, and Ellison knew it. Stanley's alcohol consumption was increasing day by day, and he didn't even remember the last time he wasn't somewhat drunk. He felt helpless because he figured that if Stanley could get out of this sequestration he was condemning himself to, and maybe meet another girl, that things might start turning around for him. As he lay there, he smiled, remembering back to when Stanley had first met Ellison. He was so ecstatic for a time. Ellison had seen some changes in his mood and behavior. In point of fact, he even started seeing traces of the vivacity that Stanley possessed before the incident. Love, he knew, was the solution. And thus concludes Chapter 1. Thanks for listening.